Hi, how are you all doing? Yeah? I want to thank all of you for being here because I know we all came to take something away from our own businesses and goals and aspirations, but I also just want you to know that for a year, the board of the CBIS group has been working diligently to make sure that this can happen, and you are all my dream come true. You are the ones who are going to change society, and it's just really exciting. So I hope at the end of the day you feel awesome, as Alyssa would say. So thank you very much. Any of you ever seen this book before? Hold that thought. Aging has its benefits and its liabilities. So the event today is actually called The Spirit of Entrepreneurship. Jeff touched on it a little bit when he was talking about it being something within you. Okay? So I want to ask, when does the spirit of entrepreneurship start? Is it hereditary? Is it born out of necessity? Is it a game or an escape from that humdrum everyday world? Is it a creative impulse or a spontaneous urge? Can you catch this spirit more than once? And what type of character takes the plunge, often into the unknown, with an unbeatable bright idea, hope, passion, and yes, what is the word we've all learned? Resilience. Our keynote speaker is a very, very special person. Luis has each of these attributes, and may I say, many, many more. Suffering from asthma at a young age with very thoughtful parents who used living in a high altitude as his therapy, Luis was reading National Geographic about a mountain climber and decided his life would be dedicated to high altitude mountaineering at the top of the world's highest peaks. How many of you all have been to 19,000 feet altitude? Whoa! And recent return. It's not something all of us do every day. I want to know, was his first summit at 14 years old fun? Will he share the story of what happened at that point? What about the 6 summits of Everest? Were they easy? Was fighting for Tibetan refugees gunned down by Chinese soldiers a safe and quiet way to run his business? And what do all of his life-threatening adventures have to do with each of you here today? Mark Twain once said, 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things that you didn't do than the ones you did do. So throw off the bowlines, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trade winds. In your sails, explore, dream, discover. May I introduce Luis?
Wow, it doesn't get any better than that. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. Everybody awake? Alive, alert, oriented? Excellent. So you raise a lot of really interesting questions, and ones I hope to share with all of you today. So I didn't just wake up one day and decide to go climb Mount Everest. Probably the same way that you didn't just wake up one day and say, I'm going to empty my bank account, start a business, cast everything to the wind. Or maybe you did. But the bottom line is that it began somewhere. It began with a dream. It began with an idea of what was possible. So today what I'd like to share with you is my story and hopefully help you understand that regardless of the path that you're on, all of those traits that make that perseverance and tenacity successful apply regardless of the goal that you choose. So, like my introduction so poignantly pointed out, I was born a really sick little kid, basically the boy in the bubble. I couldn't really go outside until I was 10 years old. Debilitating asthma and allergies kept me locked up inside to the point where if my bedroom window was open and a next door neighbor mowed the lawn and the grass sort of filtered in, that would send me to the hospital with an asthma attack. If my mom let the house get too dusty, that would send me to the hospital and have me placed on a nebulizer. But one of the interesting things happened is I was sitting in my bedroom every night. What I would do would take stacks of National Geographic magazines from my father's library to bed with me, and I'd start flipping through the pages of these articles. And I came across, in the August 1963 edition, an article about the first American team on Mount Everest. It turns out the first American to climb Everest, Jim Whittaker, also had asthma and allergies. So the first thing I asked my parents with that magazine was, Mom, Dad, someday I want to be a mountain climber. I want to be just like this guy. So whenever anybody would ask me, little boy, what do you want to do when you grow up? I'd look them square in the eye and say, I want to be a mountain climber. I want to be a mountain guide. I'm going to climb Mount Everest. And then I'd take a puff off of my inhaler and I'd go wheezing down the road. But it's the dream, right? It's the goal, it's the spark that everybody starts with. So as the years went on and I got into high school, and bit by bit, my illness started to abate. My parents listened to my doctors and actually started taking me to Ecuador, where my father is from, to help me walk around at high altitude and strengthen my lungs. Now, an Ecuadorian version of a fun Sunday is to grab grandma and grandpa, all the cousins, pile them in a car, drive from the city up to these high alpine huts at 15,000 feet at the base of some of these mountains. Pack a picnic, eat your bologna sandwich, get a really bad altitude headache from how high you are, and then toddle back down to the car and drive back to the city. That's an Ecuadorian family's idea of a fun Sunday out. Well, as I was doing this week over week and month over month, I never got to see any of the climbers that were actually there attempting some of these peaks. But one day, one afternoon, the weather was so bad that everybody that had left for their summit push piled back into the hut. The door slammed open and all the men had ice in their beards and the women had ice in their braids and they had all this clanking equipment on. And something inside of my head clicked. I remembered that dream from when I was a little kid with my National Geographic magazine, and I knew that this was the tribe I needed to be a part of. This was the tribe that I needed to be around. And if somehow, some way I could just hang out with these people, maybe, just maybe, I could get to the Himalayas. So as high school progressed and all of my friends got the traditional high school jobs, mowing lawns, lifeguard at a pool, babysitting, anything you can normally think of, I had one request of my parents. I wanted to go back to Ecuador and be a hut boy on this mountain, Cotopaxi. Now, let me ask you a question. Has anybody here ever seen the movie Waterboy with Adam Sandler? You guys know that one? Yeah, that's kind of what being a hut boy is like. It is that entry-level, god-awful, thankless job where you are up before sunrise, melting snow, boiling water to fill everybody's thermoses and water bottles that are leaving for their summit attempts, making breakfast for all the climbers. As soon as all the climbers leave, you sweep the floors, you clean the bathrooms, and when they come back from their summit attempts, you do it all over again. Entry level, right? But the difference for me was I was finally part of that tribe I had dreamed for so long to be connected to. And I loved it. I loved every minute of it. When I think back on that now, all the nights and early mornings sweeping the floor and filling water bottles, it didn't matter because I was connected to the one thing that I was passionate about. So one afternoon, about around my freshman year in college, as I was still doing this job, a couple of really well-known and well-respected mountain guides came into the kitchen as I was wrapping up dinner. Now, the interesting thing about Ecuador is international guiding companies will bring their clients to Ecuador to train on some of these smaller peaks before they go on to iconic climbs all around the world. So if any of you have ever read the book Into Thin Air that highlights the 1996 tragedy on Mount Everest, the names Scott Fisher, who owned Mountain Madness in Seattle at the time, and Rob Hall, who owned Adventure Consultants in New Zealand at the time, were the two guys that walked into my kitchen. And they said, Luis, we've got a problem. Our assistant guides didn't come up from Quito tonight. We have no turnaround guides for our summit attempt this evening. We were wondering if you'd be interested in being our assistant guide, so if anybody gets sick and has to turn around, you could go up and get them. The first thing I heard was that I just got my first job as a mountain guide. So what do you say? Absolutely, yes, of course, I'd love to help you guys out. Still had to do the job I was hired to do. Still had to clean up dinner, make sure all the water bottles were filled. But I clearly remember as they handed me their team radios that night and I crawled into my sleeping bag, I remember looking at the top of my bunk having this very distinct thought, please somebody get sick. Please, just somebody get sick so I can actually prove myself to these guys and continue on my career trajectory at that point. So sure enough, 3 o'clock in the morning, Rob's radio crackled to life. Luis, I've got 2 clients. I'm going to leave them at the edge of the glacier. They're not feeling very good. And then Scott's radio crackled to life. Luis, I've got one more. I'm going to leave them with Rob's 2 clients. Could you come up to the edge of the glacier and pick these guys up? I immediately jumped out of my sleeping bag. I chopped up cheese and salami. I filled a thermos with tea. I raced up to the edge of the glacier. I laid out this beautiful picnic spread at 4:30 in the morning for these 3 people that were feeling incredibly ill from the altitude. I said, good morning, my name is Luis. I'll be your rescuer. Would you like some cheese and crackers? One guy promptly threw up all over my entire spread. But it brought to mind this idea of service for me. Service in the face of adversity. When things are really, really tough, how do you find a way to still provide value in the product that you're trying to deliver? So I share this next picture with you to illustrate a very important point. This is the upper reaches of Cotopaxi. And I don't know if you can see it very well, but these little tiny dots, those are people. It gives you a sense of the scale of this mountain. I tried to summit this thing 32 times before I actually made the top. Now let me explain why. As the junior, if anybody wanted to turn around, guess whose job it was to bring them back to the hut? If somebody wasn't feeling well, guess whose job it was to turn them around? If somebody read Outside Magazine, liked the glossy pictures, went to REI and bought all the gear, came down to Ecuador to go climbing, took one step out of the hut, decided it wasn't for them, guess who had to stay back with them? It was me. That was my job. 32 times before I actually made it to the top. So it begs the question, whatever you're facing, how bad do you want it? How bad do you actually want what you're going after? Because in the middle of all this drudgery, there are these amazing moments, and we have all had them. In the middle of the craziness, in the middle of all the noise, there are these intense, brilliant moments that seem to make all the hard work worthwhile. And for me, it was no different. I got to understand the culture that my father came from in Ecuador. No, this is not my father. This is actually a porter that we used to help us in a very remote peak called Sangue in Ecuador. And it also helped me understand the cultural nuances of literally and metaphorically sharing that load with the people that are around you, the people that work with you. Now, about this time in my career, I had some pretty decent success as a mountain guide. For as young as I was. College was ending. I had made a definitive choice to make mountain guiding my career for the foreseeable future. I had no idea how long it would go, but I thought I'd lean in and give it a try. And about this time, a good friend of mine, who later turned into a great mentor, sat me down because he said he wanted to give me a little bit of career advice. I worshipped this guy, so I was all ears. I wanted to hear what he thought my next step could or should be to advance my career. He sat me down and he said, Luis, you've had blinding success for your age in the mountains. For as sick as you were as a kid, and for everything that you do now, you're leading people up these gigantic, dangerous mountains, and they're 3 times as old as you are, and you've been incredibly successful. What happens when you hear stuff like that? The ego just starts to swell, the head gets a little bigger, and I just sat there and said, yes, please, tell me more about me. I'd love to keep hearing what you have to say. Then he said a really interesting thing that stuck with me. He said, for all the success you have, the one piece of advice I would give you, and the one thing I've observed, is that your people skills suck. Stop me cold. Stop me completely cold. Like, well, wait a minute, you just told me that I'm really good at what I do because I'm getting people up and down mountains safely, but you're telling me my people skills suck. None of my clients have gotten frostbite. None of my clients have had any limbs fall off or broken any bones. How do my people skills suck? And he said something that I'll never forget. He said, Luis, for you, it's very black and white. If someone is strong enough to come on your journey with you, you are all smiles. You high five everybody, you bring them along with you, you get to the summit, and you get back down safely. If someone can't climb with you, isn't strong enough to make that journey with you, you cut them loose like dead weight. You don't give them a second thought. You completely burn them off. And I said, well, they have to come with me. They're tied to the rope that I'm on, so they don't really have a choice. He said, yeah, but you're not just a mountain guide, you're also a leader. And as a leader, if you can't explain where you're going and why, really explain where you're going and why. How can you ever expect anybody to want to follow you? And that really stuck with me. And so he said, I'll make you an offer. He said, I'm a course director at this organization in Colorado called Outward Bound. They don't just work on mountaineering skills, they also work on character development and communication. It's a program for kids. Why don't you just go spend a summer and work for Outward Bound? In relation to your mountain guiding, it'll help improve your soft skills. Now at the time I thought, wow, Outward Bound, I know some iconic mountaineers that have come out of that program. I'm thinking, I'm going to get more technical skills by going to work for Outward Bound. This is fantastic. I signed up, and the first thing that I did at new staff training, when I arrived, they made me sit in a circle and talk about how climbing made me feel. Feelings. Now, at this point in my career, I was a technically oriented mountain guide. My goal was to climb Mount Everest. That would require every level of technical acumen I could get my hands on, and this group of yo-yos wanted me to sit around and talk about how climbing made me feel. It was uncomfortable. It was clunky. It was weird. All of a sudden, when I said, go there to students, they would ask me, why? They would say, help me learn how to read a map and compass. Teach me how to use the stove so I don't burn my dinner. So it was this great exploration to understand that the human side of leadership, those feelings that are incorporated with being a strong leader, are just as important as the end game. And as the years went on and I bounced back and forth between guiding and working for Outward Bound, I was kind of getting to this point professionally where I realized it was the first tipping point that I would experience. We've all had probably multiples of those in our career and in our lifetime, and this was the first one for me. I was working with a group of 8th graders in Denver. We had just gone rock climbing for the afternoon. And Jose, the biggest 8th grader on the planet at the time, on the right-hand side, saw me kind of feeling sorry for myself sitting in a corner, and he came over and he asked me, you know, what's wrong? So I poured my heart out to this kid and I said, you know, I've been doing this job for a couple of years. I put what I went to school for on hold. I really think this is my path, but I'm not quite sure how to get to the next level. And he looked me square in the eye and he said, Luis, what have we been working on all day? And then it hit me. The curriculum that we had been working with these kids on that day for rock climbing was a very simple 3-question process. The first question that we asked them whenever they were faced with a problem was, what's the problem? Give it a name, give it a shape, put some words to it. And if you're actually willing to give it a shape and put some words to it, the second question is, so what? Why is it so important for you to say whatever it is that you're facing out loud? And then the third question we asked them to face was, if it's really that important, now what? What are you going to do about it to actually make the change that you're lamenting? So Jose looked me square in the face and kind of waggled his head and said, what are you going to do about it? Only from the mind of a child, right? So this is what I did. I got tactical. I pulled a map out of a magazine and I started putting push pins up on all the iconic mountain ranges around the world, right? This is future state business model for me. I thought if I could get to any of these iconic mountain ranges all over the world and climb just a little bit, maybe, just maybe, I would get a shot at going to the Himalayas. So I started looking at this map critically and thinking, okay, I know there are big mountains in Africa. I don't speak Swahili. I know there's big mountains in Europe, don't speak French or German. Big mountains in Russia, don't speak Russian. Big mountains in South America, I definitely speak Spanish. And big mountains in Alaska, I'm an American. Who do I know that runs trips in all of these places? And then I took the thought a little bit further. I started looking at companies that guided the 7 summits, the highest mountain on each of the 7 continents, of which Everest is the biggest and one of the 7 summits. And then I thought back to my first job as a hut boy on Cotopaxi, Scott Fisher and Rob Hall. So fortunately I had both of their phone numbers, and it was the ultimate cold call. I called Scott Fisher in Seattle thinking a job was locked up because I saved his bacon the night that his assistant guides didn't show up. Certainly he was going to give me a job. Called him, got through, said, hi Scott, my name's Luis, I don't know if you remember me. I helped you that one trip in Ecuador. I was wondering if you have any openings. I'd really like to guide for you on the 7 summits. I'd like to get to Everest someday. I did the whole 5-minute elevator pitch. Scott politely said thank you, said he had no idea who I was, didn't remember me, and hung up the phone. First cold call, done. So then I thought, okay, I'm going to call Rob Hall in New Zealand. I actually had his mobile number. I didn't quite factor in the time change for New Zealand to Colorado. So I ended up calling Rob at about 3 o'clock in the morning in Wanaka. And because Rob ran an international guiding company at the time and had a lot of teams all over the world, he has to pick up the phone whenever it calls. So Rob picked up the phone. I gave my same 5-minute spiel. He was nice enough to say, Luis, you know, we actually have some openings for programs in South America. I'd love to talk to you about it. Give me about 4 more hours to sleep and then call me back. First shot, broke through that first door. He sent me down to Aconcagua, which is the highest mountain in the southern hemisphere, one of the 7 summits, on the border of Chile and Argentina, for my first big trip. And I was excited. I showed up to base camp to start working for the first big company in the tribe that I so desperately wanted to be a part of. Now, when people think of international mountaineering, they usually think of stuff like this, that glossy picture in Outside magazine that has the climber glinting off into the sunrise. And what I tell people, the reality, and you all know this from being entrepreneurs, is more like this. The job is literally and figuratively helping people manage their baggage all over the world, whatever that baggage is. If it gets lost, if they think they're in over their head, if you think you're in over your head, you have to find a way to keep it all together and get to your destination with what I call the toothbrush principle. If your toothbrush doesn't get lost and you have those creature comforts, ultimately, regardless of how chaotic it is, you're going to be okay. Now, showing up to Aconcagua was really interesting because I got to work with my first staff member. Anybody here ever worked with mules before? Would you agree that they are calm, docile, cooperative creatures? No? So, I show up to Aconcagua, I show up to the trailhead, my first big expedition as a mountain guide for a 7 summits company, and I see all these mules packing loads to go to base camp. And I think to myself, let me get this straight. I got a promotion, I'm working for a world-renowned company, and now all I need to do is carry a small backpack to base camp. These guys are going to do all the work for me. So not only did I get a promotion, but my job just got easier. That can't be right. So I was so excited. We walked off down the trail with our mule train and all the guides and all the clients, and about 2 hours into the walk, the mule that had my stuff on its back decided to do that. He's not dead. He's just taking a little nap. So, as I watched my mule train and my clients walk off into the distance and look down at the mule with all of my stuff on its back, I started thinking, you know, at this point I am a sensitive, well-connected outward bound instructor as much as a mountain guide. I am going to rationalize with this mule and I'm going to get him back on his feet. So I take an optal out of my pack, I get down on my hands and knees and I start trying to coax, come on little guy, you can do it, get back on your feet, let's go, just a little bit further. This mule driver rides up on his horse, gets off of his horse, looks at me down on my hands and knees, looks at the mule, winds up like he's kicking the final field goal for the Super Bowl and plants one on the mule's backside. I was horrified. I thought he had broken the mule's hip. But the mule, I'll never forget this, gets up, calmly looks at the mule driver, looks at me, takes the apple out of my hand, and walks off down the trail. And what the mule driver said to me is something that I'll never forget. He put his arm around me, he looked me square in the eye, and he said, you know, Luis, sometimes all it takes is a little kick. And as I've continued in my career, I've often thought about this moment. Who is it in my life, personally and professionally, that's really willing to put one on my backside when I need it the most? Now, the next lesson I learned through this journey on Aconcagua, and this is actually a picture of her at almost 23,000 feet, was a pretty simple one about sincerity. Now, most of the route on Aconcagua is just rock and scree. It's an exercise in high altitude camping and logistics, moving up and down the mountain, trying to help people stay healthy and stay fit for their summit attempt. And after a couple of successful expeditions on this peak, I started wondering what was next, and a Chilean friend of mine was sitting down with me halfway up the mountain at Camp 2 one day and said, Luis, you've had a lot of success here, but you haven't seen Escoba de Dios yet. And speaking Spanish, I know that translates to mean broom of God. And I had heard that wind events on Aconcagua were pretty big, but I had seen some storms and I didn't think much of it. Well, literally, sitting in the same spot about a week later on our summit attempt, the mountain went from looking like this to looking like that in a matter of about 20 minutes. This is the jet stream raking across the summit of the mountain. And after the storm subsided and people started coming down out of that storm from the higher camps, people had fingers that looked like that. And all of a sudden, something very, very different started to dawn on me. If I was having a bad day in my communication, if I really wasn't capable of conveying exactly what we needed to do and why, if ego got in the way, whatever it wasn't just going to be that the people around me were going to have a bad day. Somebody could get hurt or even worse, killed. And just as I was having that thought, I came around the corner and we saw 2 impromptu graves of people that didn't make it out of that storm. I was horrified. And as we continued up towards the summit, I kept asking myself, is this really worth it? It's such a fine line between success and failure, with consequences being enormous. Is it really worth it? And then the lesson really hit home once we finally reached the summit. So let me explain. It came in the form of a Valentine. Now, some of the first talks that I ever gave were to my mom's art classes. She's an art teacher in the Midwest. And this little girl, at the end of a class, gave me a Valentine and said, "Mister, would you carry this up to the summit of your next mountain, take a picture, and send it back?" And I said, sure. And of course, my mom being my mom, before I left on this trip, she said, "Now don't you forget about that Valentine. Pack it." So I packed it and I brought it to the summit, and I pulled it out and I took a picture. And she spelled lose wrong, but it's a Charlie Brown quote. How can we lose when we're so sincere? And it really got me thinking. If you're sincere in your communication, if you speak from the heart, if you really consciously take a look at what your agenda is in your communication, you can't lose. It's a fail-safe formula for success. That really stuck with me on Aconcagua and on prior trips, because the next trip I went on was something very, very different. This is Mount McKinley in Alaska, one of the 7 summits, a little over 20,000 feet, but because it's so far north, close to the Arctic Circle, it feels like about 24,000 feet. Now, this mountain for me was all about what does stretch look like, and how do you define failure? So let me explain. After a couple of seasons of working on this mountain, it's notorious for shutting groups down and not allowing summits. Some years there's only a 15% success ratios. Some years there's a 90% success ratio for people that are attempting the summit. This year, after getting kicked in the head a couple of times, I was sitting back down in town with a couple of guide friends. We had 3 weeks off, and the next stretch challenge for us came in the form of a question. What if? What if we flew into base camp with just enough food and fuel to make it to the top and back, started walking, and tried not to stop until we got back down to base camp? Base camp, summit, back to base camp in one push. We weren't going to try a new crazy route. We weren't going to do anything nuts. We just wanted to see if it was physically possible. Now, of course, guides being guides, we started having a few beers. The idea sounded even better. As the evening wore on, by the time we went to bed, it was the best idea on the planet. We were being innovative. We were really going to push it. We went to bed thinking we're going to wake up the next morning and fly into base camp. It's going to be great. And I'll never forget, I was the first one that woke up, and then my friend woke up and pointed at me, and before he even said good morning, he said, "You said it first." And I looked back at him and I said, "Yeah, but you agreed with me." And we started going back and forth, trying to talk each other out of that stretch. And the third person in our party woke up and said, "Well, both of you guys are nuts. I never agreed to it in the first place. Why would we even think about this?" But eventually when we came back around to it, we thought, if we're safe and we're sincere, let's just go as far as we can. So we flew back into base camp and started walking. I'm not going to lie and say I didn't fall asleep standing up. I did multiple times. But a little over 40 hours later, we crested the summit ridge. Now in Alaska in the summertime, the sun never goes down. So it's the suspended reality of time and space where you feel like you're not really walking, but you're walking. Physical and mental completely separate. And literally as we were moving towards the summit, I was thinking, if I can get this done and remain in one piece, this will definitely be the stupidest thing I have ever tried. As we reached the summit, it was about 60 below and blowing fiercely. I still have no recollection of this picture being taken. And as we hobbled back down to the 14,000-foot camp halfway up the mountain, we walked into camp, and my friend, who turned into a mentor, the guy that brought me to Outward Bound in the first place, Pete Athens, was standing there guiding a group of his own. He welcomed myself and my 2 teammates back into that camp, gave me a big hug, and said, "Luis, congratulations, you did such a great job. You should feel really proud. You're only 5 hours away from base camp. Take a little rest and keep going." As soon as this picture was taken, I went to my backpack that's in the background right there, promptly laid down, fell asleep, out cold. The next thing I noticed was this little boot on my butt. I opened my eyes, I looked up, and it was Pete. I said, "Hey, Pete, what's going on?" He said, "Luis, you've been asleep for about 10 minutes. Clouds are starting to roll in. Go ahead and get up, have some water, wake your buddies up, keep moving. I looked him square in the eye and I said, 5 more minutes, Mom. Just give me 5 more minutes. Now, you can see in this picture, Pete's a big guy. He's bigger than us. The next thing I remember is being shook like a rag doll, literally being shook off my feet, Pete having handfuls of snow, shoving them in my face. So the guy I was hugging 45 minutes earlier and so happy to see, a friend and mentor, I was now shoving him off of me, screaming at him, saying, how dare you put your hands on me? What's wrong with you, you freak? Leave me alone. And he said, Luis, you said I may see you like this. And you also told me that your goal was base camp to summit and back down to base camp. It wasn't base camp, summit, and then halfway back down again. You're not finished yet. Get on your feet and keep moving. The only thing I could think about in my sleep-deprived state was that damn mule on Aconcagua. Because there was Pete providing that kick that I needed when I needed it most. Over 62 hours later, we finally walked into base camp. And from that point forward, whenever I think about that stretch assignment, the thing that I always try to remind myself is that we are all capable of more than we could ever think possible. Now, the next lesson I got from Mount McKinley is one about failure. Now, this one's